Saints of the Americas is a series that seeks to share information on the life and times of the saints of the Catholic Church celebrated in the Americas. Your program hosts are Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.
Welcome to our show. We're going to talk now about Terrence Cooke. He was the 7th Cardinal Archbishop of New York, and his what they call meteoric rise in the ranks of the hierarchy is pretty much significant in his life, but also his simplicity of life and living is significant as to why he's probably on the road to sainthood. So let's give the folks that are with us a little bit of background about Cardinal Cooke.
Well, and as we first discuss him, I think our viewers might think that, it's obvious that a bishop or a cardinal, is on the road to sainthood. It's actually much more rare than people might think. But he does have that life story that is one always rooted in faith, but always rooted in New York. He was a New Yorker from start to finish, born in 1921 in a place known as Morningside Heights, which was a large immigrant conclave. He was the third child of a very large Irish family. And from the early days then, we see what we might then stereotypically think of, that very strong Irish Catholic family. A type of family where there would have been prayer for vocations, where amongst the children there might be the hope that one would go to seminary, one might go to the convent. And so we see that it is being fostered at an early age in his life by his family, by that whole development that moves forward. And so we do see that this is something that is part of his life from an early age.
And we probably want to note that there's some significant things that he was part of as his role as Cardinal Archbishop of New York that we find significant. Obviously, he was very close to many prominent families, even though his family was not prominent. Mm-hmm. But he was also a forerunner of very conservative movement in theological understanding and background, and yet very progressive when it comes to social outreach and social change. And so there's these two kind of like balances that we find in his life, which are kind of unusual, I think, for someone who's extremely conservative theologically, but yet very open and progressive on reaching out to the poor, to the needy, to the impoverished. How important it is for the life of any priest to have that balance, not necessarily that we are conservative or moderate or progressive, but that we have a balance in our life.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges is in the times we live, those words are thrown out so quickly. And it sets up divisions right away, the whole idea of being conservative or liberal, of being on the left or being on the right. And so it is kind of interesting to note that in his life. But I would say that we could kind of follow his life through the times in which he lived, the times in which he grew up and then was formed and shaped as a young priest, and then as he became a prelate, and then moved forward into the later years of his life. It really mirrors what was happening in society, and did society and the church kind of grow up together in this? I mean, we see in the 60s that great movement for social justice, for equality, and you saw it on both sides of the political spectrum. But then as it moved into almost like a pendulum swing, perhaps there was a thought that too much was up for grabs. There was too many things that could just be done away with. And I think that's where that certain sense of moving back into a more conservative theological view on things certainly is respect and dignity for life. But it was first and foremost a person who saw that respect and dignity of all human life. And so you could argue that while some of it looks liberal in terms of our views of African Americans and people of other traditions and other cultures, if you have dignity and reverence and respect for that human life, it's also going to carry over to the unborn or to other people. And so where you might find it liberal on one end and conservative on the other, it's a consistent thread through that garment or fabric of theology.
I think what's interesting too is that his coat of arms states, "Thy will be done." And so we know that's obviously part of the Lord's Prayer, the prayer that Jesus taught his disciples. But that whole sense that his entire life short as it was, dying at 62 years old, was spent in doing the will of God, and how important it is for us as followers, but in particular as priests, to understand that will of God is primarily what we are all about, to do His will. And I think Terrence Cooke always saw himself not necessarily as a great prelate, but as a simple priest. And so that really speaks volumes about how he saw himself, how he saw his role, and how he understood his vocation as a simple priest. Being elevated to the ranks of a cardinal, being probably the second youngest at the time in '69 when he was elevated, being the seventh Cardinal Archbishop of New York, where many of his auxiliaries were years older than him. And so he had something within him that others saw and that served the church very well in New York. I think one thing that I'd like to note for the folks that are with us is something that he wrote, and perhaps you and I could talk about that. These writings come directly from a diary that he kept that Father Benedict Rochelle, who helped write this book entitled Thy Will Be Done, about him, states certain things that he felt that a priest should be. And one of those things he felt a priest should be a servant. You know, I think going back to Pope Gregory the Great, who saw his role as the servant of the servants of God, and how important it is for us as priests and people to see ourselves as servant.
Absolutely, and we see that, as you said already, in those simple, unassuming ways. And even the ministries that he was called to as a priest and then as a bishop, his work with the military, trying to bring to the average person, defending our freedoms, that sense of spirituality and that sense of care and concern. We see it especially then as someone who, as you said, died relatively young, but who suffered from cancer and leukemia, to witness to other people who are just in their average daily life, illness or sickness comes into it, and that he could reach out to people in those ways. And I think that was one of the great hallmarks in that he never assumed a higher office. It was perhaps thrust upon him, but it was always just trying to bear witness and reach out in whatever circumstance he found himself in, to reach out to people in those same ways.
Well, and I think experiencing the leukemia that he had at that time enabled him to really join his suffering with Christ's suffering on the cross. And that, I think, was probably his greatest gift. And one of the reasons that the church is looking to him as perhaps being venerable, as on the way to sainthood, as a servant of God. And so we lift him up in this show, but we also have some other holy priests that we're going to talk about. We're going to take a break. Stay with us. We'll be right back. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Louis and Zélie Martin, parents of St. Therese of the Child Jesus. The book focuses on her parents' journey towards sanctity in their family life and social commitments. This book was compiled for couple and group sharing and is meant to strengthen the journey of all in marriage and family life towards sanctity and holiness. The book can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road on Route 224, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. The store is open Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com and learn more about these witnesses of our time.
Well, I've been volunteering for 18, almost 20 years. What I do is help the elderly in their homes so that they can stay in their homes.
I think a lot of times the elderly in our society are forgotten, and that's unfortunate because they have so much wisdom to share.
The other day she told me that every night when she goes to bed, she thinks about her little angel, when her little angel's going to come and check on her the next day. And that's me, yeah.
Welcome back to our show. Now we're going to talk about Father Patrick Peyton. And I think we would refer to him as kind of that crusader priest, that one who started out loving devoted to the Blessed Mother, made lots of wonderful statements, but then found his way into radio and television, film, and just went out continuing to preach the wonders of the rosary and prayer and family time together. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about him, but let's go back to that famous phrase that he is known for. And what is that?
Well, the phrase that he's known for, the people probably don't think he's known for, but would know it, is the family that prays together stays together. Mm-hmm. And certainly he was someone who was family-oriented from the very beginning. Now, not born in the United States, born in County Mayo, Ireland, but part of a large Irish family. He makes his way to the United States, finds his way into seminary. But that, as you said, from an early part of his life, that sense of devotion, certainly that sense of devotion to Mary, we see not only in the rosary, but in other novenas and other prayers, that really becomes part of his life. And what he, as you said, a bit of a crusader, he really felt the call to bring this into other people's lives. And what would be most important about him, and I think this is where we can translate into our own lives, are how do we use the mediums that are at our disposal to bear witness to Christ. You know, all of us are on Twitter, or we've got a Facebook account, you know, and not to overly evangelize people, but just to bear witness and to challenge others to come into that sense of how to live a life centered on Christ. He saw in the time that he was becoming a priest in the United States, you know, the use of radio and then the emergence of television and what movies could do. And it really helped to move his message into a whole new realm.
Well, it's interesting because as we talk about this venerable person, we think way back to other crusaders, primarily with Jesus. And then we talk about St. Paul, those who continue to spread the work and the mission of the Lord. And they used what was available to them at the time. I still remember being in certain places in the Holy Land or in Greece where they actually showed places where St. Paul preached from. And so he would find this elevated place, and it was where crowds and crowds of people could gather. And so using these means of communication to best serve the Lord and to spread the gospel is primarily what Father Peyton was all about. And you had talked about the radio and television. You know, that sometimes doesn't always take great skills to use those means of communication to get the word out. As long as we know how to speak and how to preach, how to share the good news, then those things are available to us. And I liked your transition into social media, because how often we use social media not for the spreading of the good news, but for the spreading of things that are not good. And so how important it is for us to go back to those roots to understand why these gifts of telecommunications are available for us.
Absolutely. And for Father Peyton, there would have been certainly people that thought this was not the way to go about spreading the good word. You know, that it should be the more traditional way of being in a church or simply being with a congregation. And there would have been some skepticism to using these mediums that were not being used in that way. There would have been some that might have thought that by using the radio or by using the emergence of television or using film, that was almost blaspheming, you know, in a way, without the understanding of, like you said, that in every generation it's new.
Right.
You know, and you have to take advantage of that. And how often in our current age do we hear people say, you know, I got on Facebook because I thought it was a place, you know, to share recipes or see grandchildren's pictures. And now, sadly, the vast majority of it is negative. Sure. And so I think in that spirit of Father Peyton, we should recapture those modern forms of social media to be more positive and to spread good news.
Let's go back to that whole devotion to Mary, which is primarily what his crusade was all about, because he was ill at the time and he prayed through intercessory prayer to Our Lady to cure him. And once that happened, then he felt this tremendous need to continue this great devotion to Mary, and did so through the Rosary. And as he did that, he really engaged people, prominent people, to join this crusade. And how wonderful it was that he went into the Hollywood scene, which oftentimes doesn't have the greatest or the cleanest reputation. He used those wonderful people to continue this crusade. And that's something that continues today through the wonders of reruns on television, the films that we know that he's produced. But also, this was not just for the United States. This crusade went all around the world. And how important it is for us to remember that as evangelizers, that message is to go to the ends of the earth.
Oh, absolutely. And I do think, as we keep using the term crusade, the concept of this modern sense of crusade in terms of Catholicism might be foreign to people. I would think that if we started to talk about crusades, people are going to think either of the Middle Ages, or they're going to think of more of the evangelical preachers, such as Dr. Graham. You know, and Billy Graham was known for his crusades, and that certainly was part of his ministry, but that it was also part of the Catholic faith, with people like, Father Peyton, or even we'll talk in another show about Fulton Sheen, this using this medium to go out and to spread the good news. And it is a reminder that we need to continue to do that. And as you mentioned, some very famous people at the time in Hollywood gathered around his cause, who were known to be people who tried to live a devout life. People like Loretta Young, who was known to go to Mass daily, or Ethel Barrymore, who was the first family of the stage and screen, but who herself was very devoted to her faith. And so he saw the wisdom in gathering people who had prominence, so that other people could say, if they make time and if they live their lives this way, then certainly I should think about my own way of living.
And let's go back in our final minute of this segment to highlight something that Pope John Paul II quoted when he had visited St. Patrick's Cathedral on October 7th of 1995, when he actually led the rosary there in New York City. And he said during his talk, he said he wanted to use the phrase that was made famous by the late Father Patrick Peyton: the family that prays together stays together. We would like to appeal to those families, whether you're a small family or a large family, that whole sense of praying together, whether it's around the table before any meal, or when you gather on the weekend to celebrate the Mass, or any time you gather to remember that prayer is really what binds us together. And prayer is what keeps us as family. And when we as Christians gather on the weekends to celebrate that great Mass and the Eucharist, then we gather as that global family, that universal family, to celebrate God's presence among us. Stay with us. We'll be right back. The Society of St. Paul announces a new book on Padre Pio by Italian journalist Stefano Campanella. The director of Padre Pio Television gives readers an intimate insight into this saint who Pope Francis appointed as one of the great patrons of the Jubilee Year of Mercy. This edition can be found at St. Paul's Books and Gifts at 926 Boardman Poland Road, located across from the Olive Garden restaurant. This book on Padre Pio talks about his time in the sacrament of confession with countless of Catholic pilgrims, and as a contemplative saint whose life was blessed in countless ways. Visit St. Paul's Books and Gifts Monday through Saturday from 11 a.m. to 6:30 p.m. or call 330-953-2443 or email at stpaulsbookstore@gmail.com to learn more about Padre Pio and many other great saints of the Catholic Church.
We are in our 7th year at Cristo Rey Jesuit High School. It arose from the desire of the Jesuits in the Chicago province to serve the Hispanic community here in Chicago. One of the things that's unique about this school is that our kids work 5 days a month at offices in downtown Chicago to pay for their education. That idea originated here. We got telephone calls the first day from the companies thanking us for sending us those kids to their companies. The companies feel good about themselves. 95% of our kids are the first ones in their families to finish high school, and 87% of our graduates are in college right now. This project attracts wonderful, wonderful, enthusiastic, idealistic people. They have to have the desire to kind of reach for the stars. No one believed that it would be as successful as it is. Well, it's obviously caught on, and we're very, very excited about it.
Welcome back. Now we're going to talk about Fulton Sheen. He's probably one of the best well-known Catholic prelate TV personalities of all time, Fulton Sheen. Let's talk about his famous television show.
Well, his show was Life is Worth Living, and it certainly was landmark, if you will, in terms of spreading Catholic theology and reaching out to the average Catholic parishioner who otherwise might only gain any understanding of Scripture from the homily on Sunday, maybe read the Bible on occasion, but was probably more into devotional prayers. What this did was, again, as we spoke in our last segment with Father Peyton, it used the medium of the time to reach out to as many people as possible, but to continue to challenge those people to not only live a good life, but then to share that good life with others.
It's interesting, as you were talking, I was visualizing watching his shows and even the reruns. And while it was taped in black and white, the reruns oftentimes are color now. And so he was always dressed in his bishop regalia, flowing robes and very theatrical. You remember perhaps in reruns his big chalkboard. And at the top of the chalkboard he always wrote JMJ, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, which I think the sisters used to teach us to write at the top of our page. And from there, that chalkboard became the classroom. It became the teaching vehicle whereby we learned very simply about the faith, but very dramatically about it. Why is it important for us to take the means, and we talked about that in a recent show, to take the means that are given to us to spread this good news, to spread the gospel? What happens when we don't do that?
Well, certainly if we don't do it, we're missing out on the opportunity of reaching so many people. And so why we do it is, to be perfectly honest, we have to reach out to people where they're at. As pastors of parishes, we can lament smaller crowds, but at some point we also have to say we have a responsibility to go out and to reach people where they're at. And so if it's them flipping through the channels and coming across our show on TV, if it's them in the car and hitting the dial and hitting on wineskins or one of the other programs that are done on radio, if it's through social media, through having a Facebook page or a Twitter account, I do think as much as we want to follow the traditional sense of being a parish community and inviting people into church, we have to expand that sense of what church is and reach out to people. We have that obligation. And I think that is what Fulton Sheen understood, that there was this new medium, and he felt called as an evangelizer to use that medium. He could have just sat in a church and said, where are they? But he reached out using that medium. Now, that doesn't mean that he was not tough in calling people to accountability once he did reach out to them.
It's interesting because his beginnings really were in a parish, and people would flock to hear his sermons, and this just kind of burgeoned into something even greater. And he just knew the power of the word. He understood how powerful that word was and what his role was as a priest and eventually as the bishop to share this good news and to get this word out. He also was very schooled. He understood theology very well. He had several degrees, and yet he was able to communicate the intricacies of the faith in very simple, down-to-earth, practical terms. And how important is it for us also to do that for one another, that we have to bring theology into the day-to-day dirt and grime of who we are and the work of our hands. How important is that for us to do?
Oh, it's essential, and it reminds me of the things that he was often quoted as saying when people would, complain they don't get anything out of church. And his line, again, when I said that he could be very pointed and very tough, his line was, well, what are you putting into it? Now, he didn't mean that just for the people in the pews. He meant that for all of us. And so he really did convey that whether it's the bishop or it's the priest or it's ecclesial ministers or whether it's the lay people at Mass, we are all called to be in this together, and we're all called to work together to come to an understanding. And as you pointed out, he understood very well that we needed to bring it, I hate to say down, but we needed to make it at a level where everyone could understand, could comprehend, but then go out and act on it. It couldn't just remain theological language in books. It had to be proclaimed, but then lived.
It's interesting, as I was reading a little bit more about his life on television, that kind of came to somewhat an abrupt close for him for whatever reason. But yet, that did not stop him from continuing to share that good news as a priest. And how important it is, when we talk about sharing the gospel, that at times there are going to be obstacles in the way. And part of our role is to kind of overcome those obstacles so we get that good news out. I think the other thing for us to remember is that we know that he was bishop of, I think it was Rochester, New York. Yes. He probably had hopes of going beyond that, but that was his call, and that was what the Spirit appointed him to do. And yet, as his health declined, we see that he continued to spread the good news and talk about the Lord. But then we see in later years how he became very ill and very sick, and eventually just gave up to doing all of these engagements and that. And at the end of our life, that happens to us. We get to a point where we can no longer do what we used to do, and yet that doesn't diminish the importance of what we are about to share the good news. In closing, what would you like to say about Fulton Sheen?
Well, I think, as you said, with his role as the bishop, given the title Archbishop of Rochester, and maybe the thought, we look back on his life and think, why didn't he arise to this, or why didn't he do that? I think it is a reminder that we must each become content where we have been called by the Spirit to be, but that does not diminish the work that we're called to do. And I think that Fulton Sheen stands, among many things, as that example, to find contentment, but then to offer up, wherever we're at, that witness to Christ.
Thank you for being with us. Have a good day, and God be with you.
Saints of the Americas was a production of CTNY, the Catholic Television Network of Youngstown. Your program hosts were Father Jim Corda and Father Jack Lavelle.